Hi, I'm Lauren Card, VP of Operations and Regulatory Affairs for PDA. This is the second podcast in our regulatory series where we explore whether regulatory hurdles are stifling access to innovative animal health products in Canada. Today I'm speaking with Kira Salonius, the Chief Executive Officer of Previwo, a Norwegian company that is trying to bring their natural probiotic product to Canada, but is experiencing some unexpected regulatory challenges. Over a decade ago, Previwo discovered and subsequently developed several bacterial strains from the Vibrio species. They are naturally found in and around salmon and play an important role in maintaining the optimal health of the fish. When fish are healthy, they are better able to resist disease from bacterial pathogens and parasites. Previwo's product, Stembiont Vital, is a ready-to-use solution including 3 Vibrio strains that is administered in the anesthetic bath during routine vaccination. According to the Food and Agricultural Organization, global aquaculture production was estimated at 88 million tons in 2020. The FAO has clearly stated that aquaculture is essential to global food security and that further expansion of aquaculture requires the acceleration of sustainable innovation that prioritizes preventative solutions. This means equipping producers with the necessary tools to ensure fish grow and utilize feed optimally, resist disease when faced with pathogens, and have safe and efficacious treatment options when disease occurs. Sea lice is a common parasite affecting salmonids. These copepods attach to the skin of the fish to feed, which causes lesions. In Canada, where salmon producers have limited options to prevent sea lice infections, it is estimated that sea lice costs between $2 and $4 per fish. Given that a typical salmon farming operation has around 1 million fish, this means losses of up to $4 million per operation. So the disease has significant economic impacts and also negatively affects animal welfare. A recent analysis in Norway, which has the greatest salmon production globally, is showing that costs associated with the treatment of sea lice are the highest production costs, even exceeding the cost of feed. Kira, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for taking the time.
Yes, great to be here. As a Canadian myself, working outside Canada now, it's really a pleasure to contribute to the conversation.
Excellent. So Kira, tell us a little bit about yourself. Walk us through your academic and professional background and how you became the CEO of this great company.
Sure. I'm an Easterner by birth. Grew up in New Brunswick. Did my Bachelor of Science with an honors thesis under a professor of microbiology who did a lot of focused work on fish diseases. So that got me interested in the area. And of course, the proximity to the Bay of Fundy also was a good learning ground. We did a lot of sampling in the field during that portion of my study and degree. And then transitionally, after a period of international travel, about 1 year, I managed to receive a NRC scholarship to go forward with postgraduate work, and then I could have the luxury of choosing where I wanted to bring that support, and I decided to do a master's in the Department of Animal Science at University of British Columbia. So then we were back and forth, mostly focused on physiology and immunology of wild and hatchery reared fish. And my thesis and publication subsequently in the Canadian Journal of Aquatic Sciences was around stress in fish and the impact on disease resistance, cortisol response, and how that differed between fish reared in a natural environment, wild, versus colonized as an intermediate, and then versus a hatchery reared fish. So it was a really seemingly a good start, I guess. And after graduation there, I joined Aqua Health Limited, which was then a proprietary company in Prince Edward Island. I don't know if everyone knows the history of it, but we had global fish vaccines. Mostly 80% of our market was export, and caught the eye of an international pharmaceutical company who purchased the company outright. So, I mean, most of my training and education within field of aqua health comes from being a vaccinologist, working in Novartis, and being eventually the director of R&D for the global operation.
Excellent. So then how did you stumble across Previvo?
Well, I've always had a lot of work and travel back and forth, being that Norway is the biggest producer of farm salmon. So, I mean, and the international community always recognizes the strength of research on fish disease in Norway. So, I was invited to kind of contribute to a project at the time of a startup company who wanted to commercialize approaches to managing winter ulcer. And two of those approaches were a probiotic approach, and the other was a vaccine to develop with a new technology. So we have those things both in our company portfolio, but of course, I mean the very exciting and interesting area that we're working in currently in terms of commercialization and market penetration is regarding microbial enhancement products or probiotics.
Perfect. So that leads me to my next question. For our listeners, can you define what a probiotic is?
Sure. It is a live microorganism that is used or administered to, and not necessarily orally, but traditionally orally, to improve gut health. That would be the traditional definition of a probiotic. In animals, the application can also be via the water, as per the classification of feed additive, and that is the scientific advice from the European Commission, and also the route forward for any harmonized regulatory environment such as Chile, which focuses on being harmonized with the EU.
Okay, perfect. And I think for our listeners too, the most common example would be like your yogurt. Most yogurts, I think probably all yogurts have those live microbials in them, and those are probiotics. So this is something that people have been exposed to for a very long time. Anyone who eats yogurt regularly will be regularly consuming those probiotics. So your product, Stem Beyond, it includes 3 of these Alivibrio strains. Can you tell me a little bit more about those strains? How did you discover them, first off?
Yeah, well, we are working to develop the novel research of a researcher called Dr. Henning Sorum. He's 35-year microbiology and bacteriology professor at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences. And in the main, his focus area of research is bacterial interactions, both pathogenic and non-pathogenic bacteria. Obviously, all living things live in harmony and in synergy with the bacterial populations. As you and I know, Laura, we have, probably more bacterial DNA, or absolutely more bacterial DNA than human DNA in our bodies. So there is a philosophy about a balanced and non-dysbiotic state or non-disease state includes that interaction and support that the microbial communities in our bodies give us. It's the same for all living things, plants, animals, whether they're in a productive food chain environment or whether they're actually free living, it's the same synergy. So essentially, in nature, as you grow up, whether you're a human or whether you're a fish, alevin, fry, etc., you're interchanging bacteria with your environment, received from your food, but especially from in the fish's circumstance, received from the aqueous environment. So in a natural circumstance, a salmon would be building up its composition of microbiome, which is basically the bacterial community that lives within it, over time, from natural sources like the water, the soil microorganisms, etc.
Okay.
Specifically about Alivibrio, they are marine species that are ubiquitous and naturally occurring. The genus contains both pathogenic and apathogenic or benign bacteria. So we purposefully looked for benign bacteria with the potential to be probiotic in fish, owing to the fact that there's a lot of models about symbiosis of this particular genus of bacteria in symbiotic relationships classically in marine research.
Okay. And where on the fish are these Alivibrio species typically found? Are they in the gut? Are they on the skin?
In the main, they can be systemically isolated, but most often it is a culture that's stemming from classically non-culturable bacteria. I think some of our listeners would be aware that 90% plus of bacteria on Earth are non-culturable by traditional means. So we have a special technique to be able to elucidate or find which bacteria might be health supportive in overall, and in the main we are isolating those from fish but also from the natural environment, and it is actually very pervasive that they are continuing to support the robust health of fish throughout their natural life, and in food production system then that would be the natural life until salmon are entering the food chain, for instance.
Okay. And so, Kira, knowing that these are sort of a natural component of the fish microbiome, what happens to the fish if, say, these Alivibrio species are not present in insufficient numbers? Are there negative health consequences for the fish?
Well, the bacteria that might comprise probiotic or helpful bacteria, let's put it in a common term, um, are broad. I mean, there are other species and other areas that also contribute to robust health in salmon. We have selected and focused on these ones, as I said, when we first kind of conceptualized what we would need to be able to deliver a preventive approach to reinforce the fish's ability to resist and reduce the risk of disease. We were looking at the pathogenic species that are in Vibrio species and also in Alivibrio species. And with this bacterial interaction, because probiotics are classically outcompeting pathogenic bacteria, then we focused on those that would contribute to an indication for reduction in wounds. So basically, a risk reduction for bacterial ulcerative disease, which is prevalent, and I think maybe we haven't spoken about how prevalent, but it is contributive in the main. One of the main risk areas for Norwegian aquaculture, and at least reviewing material and information about winter wounds and summer wounds in Canada in aquaculture, then equally 50% of salmon populations are suffering to a certain extent from these types of bacteria that cause ulceration on the skin and the surface of the fish.
Okay.
Penetrating, if they get more severe, deep penetrating wounds that actually compromise the fish's ability to survive.
Okay. So what I'm hearing is, so if the fish is in a state of dysbiosis, and dysbiosis generally means when you're talking about the microbiome, you want to have a good balance of beneficial microbes, because if your beneficial microbes are not sufficient, it sort of paves the way to allow pathogenic or harmful microbes to come in and colonize there. And so if the fish is in a state of dysbiosis where they don't have enough of these beneficial microbes, it allows for these pathogens to come, and that can cause the ulcerative disease that you're talking about.
Right. It's a purposeful introduction of high pulse of these bacteria. As I said, they naturally are picked up once the fish enter into the marine environment. But to the degree that we're using them as an application, we want to direct that activity toward the classical approaches that the probiotics are doing, in innate immunological training, the competitive inhibition that we've already observed, broadly speaking, from lab and field studies, and in addition to that, because of the reduction energy and metabolic spend on a higher disease state in fish that haven't been given this preventive microbial reinforcement, then of course then you get a better feed conversion, a better specific growth rate in populations that are treated.
Okay. So that kind of leads into a good segue about your specific product and the beneficial effects that you're seeing. So can you talk to me first of all about how this product is actually administered to the fish?
Yes, yeah, as I said, it's not conventionally a probiotic applied in feed. Fish are basically, if you made the analogy about yogurt and human, functionality and gut health, and it's clear that fish have a mucous membrane over their whole skin surface, and in the main, we've determined and published on the fact that the mucus, the skin, the epidermis, is actually actively taking up bacteria from the environment at all times. So using that very efficient and practical means that you can do, then the port of entry for these bacteria is via the skin directly into the blood, and we have already studied that these bacteria persist as a member of the microbiome of the fish throughout its life. So if you could interpret that to be that it is a purposeful introduction of bacteria that then steer these processes of policing, let's call it, for competitive inhibition, teaching, which is kind of the immunological training, because the responses that the fish have to apathogenic bacteria are different than the responses that they have to pathogenic bacteria. So they don't fight them, they don't combat them, they welcome them, and then they form a good part of the robust, I guess, synergy between bacteria and any living species.
Interesting. Yeah. So, just for our listeners too, so when we talk about competitive inhibition, essentially what we're doing is by introducing these beneficial microbes into the microbiome of the fish, there is now less room for pathogens to inhabit that microbiome of the fish.
Yes, it is displacement, but it's also influence because bacteria have these kind of mechanisms, just cell signaling. It's called crosstalk, basically. So there are kind of, if you could call it that, master-slave relationships between bacteria. Populations influence one another, and it seems that these alivibrio really reduce the presence of pathogenic bacteria causing wounds.
Interesting. Okay. So, my next question has to do with sea lice, which is a parasitic infection that I talked about in my intro that is really having a detrimental effect on salmon operations globally. So, in Canada, Kira, what are the current options that producers have to treat or prevent this infection?
Yeah, they're fairly limited, of course. There are chemotherapeutic or chemical approaches that are registered as in pest control. They vary in availability east to west, but they're fairly limited in option. I'm going to probably stumble on the proper names and the regulatory status of them all, but in the main, it's very easy for lice to adapt and develop resistance. So the utility of any chemical approach, whether it be emamectin benzoate or salmosan or any of the other approved treatments in Canada, they have limited utility. They have to be used in a rotational manner because it is within a very short period of time. The louse is a very clever organism that develops resistance to those chemical treat and kill type of approaches for management. In addition, I mean, it's broadly the reflection that I made on Norwegian salmon aquaculture that most of the chemical approaches to controlling lice are used very limitedly now because in the main the industry has switched to mechanical approaches or physical removal approaches, either with thermal, meaning warm water treatments, laser lice killing equipment, with mechanical delicing approaches. And what those are fairly effective, but also increase the degree to which the fish is affected in terms of its welfare. They're, soft-bodied animals, so they have a propensity to lose this protective mucus layer. They can also be easily scariated and damaged in the process of the lice removal. So I guess overall, I mean, every aquaculture environment has goals towards sustainability, towards improving fish welfare. Um, but but one of the drivers of the initiative to bring more preventive approaches that the fish then can, be vehicleized to develop more robust resistance to lice and parasitic infection, but also to bacterial disease, is that you would like to do that ahead, less firefighting, more prevention. So it it's really easy for people to see the effect of a chemical treatment, because the knockdown effect on lice is immediate. But necessarily, I mean, those lice are just coming back, and with the development of resistance, then, you know, people can sometimes say, if you had, we'll be in really deep trouble if we kill the last non-resistant louse, because then overall you have this. What do you do then? So, I mean, I know the process in Canada and the regulatory environment for the registration of new chemotherapeutics is difficult, but also most of the things that have an effect, I'll call it efficacy, but a high effect on lice killing and ectoparasite killing, are also really, really persistent in the environment, and the ecological consequence on non-target species, including some very valuable crops like lobster, have been a concern, especially on the East Coast. And of course, the industry would like to move to more environmentally sustainable solutions.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you talked about the resistance, which is huge. And so slice, which is the amamectin benzoate you talked about, I think that has been on the market for so long. And yeah, resistance is a huge issue, to the point where it's sort of largely ineffective. And I think the environmental safety concerns too, for listeners who aren't aware, these salmon are being raised in the open ocean. That's where these farms are. And so when you're administering these parasiticides to treat them, or other chemical options like hydrogen peroxide or formaldehyde, which are also approved, that is going to result in drug residues in the ocean. It's going to affect the ocean health. It's going to target those non-target species, like you said, the lobsters as well. So lots of issues with this sort of chemical treatments. And so you talked about how it's really important to try to prevent these infections from occurring in the first place. Then there's less disease and less need to treat. So talk to me specifically about your product. You talked about how it gets taken up by the fish. It's part of the microbiome. How does this help the fish better able to resist these infections from sea lice?
Well, we really don't know the mechanisms. There are lots of theories around now, but at least on the productivity side, in Norway, they have very advanced monitoring type of approaches for lice management, because that treatment alert and alarm levels to trigger treatment are really related to an approach that the regulators have to minimize buildup of heavy lice infections on farm salmon, so that they don't impact the wild populations. Now, one could argue whether they're actually biologically at the right level, because we're talking, between zero point 0.2 and zero point 0.5 adult lice per fish to trigger a treatment recommendation in Norway. In Canada, I think, if I'm up to date with this, East and West are a bit different in terms of how they regulate, but I think it's 3 adult lice per fish. I'm pretty sure that's the recommendation in British Columbia. And on the East Coast, it's provincially regulated. So I'm thinking, I seem to remember that 4 or 5 adult lice per fish. So those aren't biologically significant infections for farm salmon. But obviously, if you don't stop that developing infection, one single mature female louse, for instance, can generate egg strings that would then have progeny of 3,000. So, I mean, you can see how infection levels could exponentially increase. So what we've observed in the field, at least, is that there's a slow development, especially of mature adult females, which is the chief concern, but also generationally that the louse is then having fewer, reaching a point of viability in terms of the number of eggs they produce. So what we really will anticipate over time is a generational effect where the lice levels will be reduced further and further. At first, we thought we started. It wasn't necessarily expected that we would have an indication that ectoparasites were something that a probiotic approach could improve the degree of infection. But we theorized first because the skin health, the robust, shiny nature of it, the amount of the intact nature of the mucus. It all looked like, these fish are really looking very good. And we thought barrier function of mucus was very important in terms of reduction of lice infection. But subsequently, we find out that there actually is a lot more to determine about why we see these reductions. And overall, we've had in controlled studies more than 12 million fish enrolled to make a good, clean comparisons between treated and untreated pens, for instance. And the overall reduction in those critical adult females who go to maturity and disseminate all those egg strings is 30%. And the economic impact of that can be realized if then that teaches a different treatment regimen or a mechanical delousing regimen, because each time you impose those sorts of things on fish, there's a period of inappetence afterward, after handling. There's a reduction in the fish's weight gain over time, missed feeding days. So that's obviously of interest to farmers, but also that if we have data now that shows that actually any treatment, whether it be chemical or mechanical, because of the weakened nature of the louse and perhaps the less, let's call it, I guess I would say that to be euphemistic or just to make it seem more humane about it, I think that the lice actually they are more weakly attached. So in a mechanical circumstance, they are more easily removed and weaker. So when you apply a chemical delousing strategy, it potentiates that effect, and between 20 and 25% improvement in the actual louse measure that you're using to control. So it has to be considered that if you have that foreground and the fish is coming with a more robust ability to resist the lice infection, and we don't, obviously, to control to those levels of lice infection, you need to also use some measures for mechanical or chemotherapeutic approaches in order to meet the regulatory standard for lice loads. But in fact, I mean, obviously, we're motivated, and everyone in industry is motivated to reduce costs, but also to improve on sustainability aspects like use of chemicals and like things that cause poor fish welfare outcome. I mean, I didn't mention one of the other strategies that's used, and I think it's just used on Canada East, is the use of an alternative species. They're called cleaner fish, and their natural habitat is they can feed on ectoparasites like lice that exist on salmon. So if you imagine, you remember that you've seen that probably in other species like cattle, for instance. There are certain things that will then use the parasites that exist on cattle as a food source. So this cleaner fish do that quite aptly. But there is an ethical concern with using one species, because ultimately 100% of cleaner fish within salmon production are either culled or not used. It's an ethical concern regarding the use of a cleaner fish species in a food production system, because they are a fish, they are a living entity themselves. So that has certain concerns in terms of ethics and welfare, extending to that species or those species that are used as cleaners.
That's really interesting, Kira. Thanks for that great summary. Um, let's talk about another disease. We spent a lot of time on sea lice. The other one that you mentioned that causes significant ulcerative disease is this Tenacibaculum maritimum. And that's a bacterial disease, so it's different than the sea lice, which is a parasite. I know this disease has quite high mortality. So, in terms of the treatment of this one, given that it's a bacterial disease, are antibiotics effective against this one?
It's really rapid in onset, and researchers quite often indicate that that is almost a toxicity kind of response rather than a development of disease over time. So really acute. So oftentimes the fish become too sick to actually eat antibiotic treated feed. So it's quite limited in terms of being able to control with medicaments. Um, it is Tenacibaculum maritimum on the west coast of Canada. In the main, it's Tenacibaculum finmarkensis on the east coast. But equally, they have it's an unmet situation with regard to development of vaccines. And in my past life, let's call it, we definitely had active projects to look at Tenacibaculum vaccines. It's a very difficult organism to vaccinate against.
Okay.
So therefore, a more broad-based, let's call it preventive approach that uses a probiotic is actually potentially a very good area of opening up any available tool that could be used to mitigate against that.
Okay.
We did some preliminary work in a Canadian research lab, and we did see an effect. I can't say that can qualify that, but we would really like the opportunity to be able to open up to use of this natural and sustainable approach to managing fish welfare, basically. And it is in the main where there are limited solutions for industry to use, that these products have a broad approach, whereas a vaccine developed is a specific targeted antigen against a specific targeted disease. That being said, I mean, we've also been doing work looking at the fact that I think I may have skipped over the fact that in the main, the most efficient point to administer a probiotic is in 100% of fish are vaccinated in aquaculture. So when they are gathered to be vaccinated, they go into an anesthetic tank, which is a significantly high density. This is an appropriate time to administer this high pulsive probiotic bacteria, and our dosing on the inclusion of the live bacteria is tailored to be taken up within the appropriate time, 60 seconds or so before fish are anesthetized, reaching stage 2 anesthesia to go forward in the process to vaccinate. But probiotics are also um, potentiating the vaccine response. So oftentimes, as you know, if you have a vaccine, then you have situations as bacteria, they can evolve, they can have different variants. So oftentimes the process of registration of the vaccine is so long and actually quite costly that companies that supply vaccines often cannot make variations to include all of the variants that are currently in an environment. So in order to improve and work in synergy with a preventive approach that is a biological vaccine, a probiotic approach is also a very good tool. Yes,
Yeah, that's really interesting.
maybe.
And I love how that with your product, there's no additional handling, how you can do it at the time of vaccination. I think that's really important from an animal welfare concern, because as you mentioned, handling of the fish, it causes huge amounts of stress, and there are negative health consequences seen because of that. And I also just really love this approach of, we administer this product, and it really optimizes the microbiome, the health of the fish. They're better able to resist disease. So it's very much like a non-therapeutic approach. We're not preventing, we're not treating, we're just enabling that fish to better
Mm.
withstand when faced with a disease challenge.
Yes, I agree. I think it is really an interesting area of work. And of course, I've mentioned to you before, we're also involved in major EU funded projects where these types of microbial intervention approaches are being levered over food animals in every production system, cattle, pigs, chickens, but also in plant production. And the results are just coming forward now on microbial intervention strategies in plant production. And it's a significant improvement because, in the main, we talk about organic production systems and we think about the fact that we prefer those types of foodstuffs because they don't contain chemicals or any other kind of environmental negative things, and we maybe philosophically like the fact that fish are fish or any other thing we eat are reared in a humane and respectful manner with regard to their welfare. But it is becoming increasingly important that it is more related to the microbes that are within those populations of organically produced animals that have more exposure to natural feeds, natural environment, exposure to air, water, etc. That means that also is a benefit. And when we get into that, you're talking about a consumer benefit of fish that have used a strategy that welcomes good, productive, beneficial bacteria in the production.
That's great. Yeah. So, Kira, I wanted to talk a little bit about the safety and efficacy of your product. So, I think you mentioned that you've studied this in about 12 million fish. So, talk to me specifically about the safety that you've seen, the safety for the fish themselves, the safety for people who may consume the products from the fish who have been administered the product, as well as the people who are handling and actually administering the product to the fish.
Yes, in the environments that we're regulated in and have approval for the use in commercial production, those would be Norway, Faroes, and Iceland. The product is approved on the basis of safety to the fish itself, so we document that there are no differences between treated and untreated fish or applied with microbial enhancement product and those not, and we follow that through all the way through the productive life cycle. But not only is it there are no negative or no negative health risks, there are also positive benefits, and I've spoken a bit about that. I mean, obviously, to be considered a probiotic in general terms and definition, then you have to show that there is a biological improvement in whatever respect you want to do. But in the main, the regulators that we've visited with so far in Iceland, being an EU community, in Faroes and in Nordics, and Norway, they're not concerned with sorting out whether the product has an efficacy or is effective. They're regulating the product and its dissemination on the basis of its environmental safety. So we look at the characterized strains, they're fully sequenced, their antimicrobial resistance marker profile is determined. They are safe to the target animal in documented trials comparing comparative groups. And there are no concerns for the consumer because they're in the what you'd call the apathogenic or class 1 GRAS microorganism.
Okay.
So that's the way they've been regulated as microbial products that are used in a broader sense in fish production. That's why we have those permissions. I don't know if we're into the discussion about regulatory frames, but as I mentioned earlier, both in the European Union, in the European Commission, is considered that waterborne microbial additions are also considered in the feed additive route. Even though they're not added to feed, they're added to a food animal. So
Okay.
that is the regulatory route that we are pursuing in Chile because they follow those EU guidances, and also in Europe as well.
Okay, that's really interesting. Yeah, so that would be different because in Canada we define a feed as something that the fish would actually consume. So
Mm.
yeah, so I want to get into the regulatory in a little bit for sure. So it sounds like your product has been very well studied in fish, completely safe, no adverse effects, which is not surprising given that it's a natural component on the fish in the environment.
Mm.
The fish have been exposed to this forever. So I also wondered if you could talk a little bit. I know you were working with Canada's Department of Fisheries and Oceans, the DFO, on a project. Are
Mhm.
you at liberty to talk a little bit about the work that was done with the DFO?
Yes, as a result of some early conversations or presentations that we'd given talking about the unique and novel microbial intervention strategies that we're using to improve the health of animals here in Norway. We were invited to speak on the Atlantic Canada Aquaculture Conference, and one of the researchers at DFO, who's had a long history of research in microbiome bacterial interactions, had invited us to participate in one of the internal research funding mechanisms in DFO called ARCDP project, and there we initiated that project I think 2 years ago, and we have 1 year left, and we've been looking at the productive impact of microbial intervention with these kinds of strains in farmed fish in controlled circumstances in the DFO laboratories in New Brunswick. So those are really interesting and exciting. The project also, as you probably are aware, involves an industry partner. So one of the larger producers of aquaculture salmon in Canada is also a partner in the project. Um, so those are going to be exciting results, and in a way, because DFO is um, a subject area expert and has a mandate towards supporting aquaculture and also wild fish from a scientific point of view, then it was an approved project, and it's been really very interesting, and we're quite glad to have been invited to participate in that. I think that it's very difficult, Lauren, to qualify a probiotic product using the kind of approaches in acute challenge models that one would generally use with high level of mortality in the untreated or controlled populations. And you'd only get an indication there of the potential for a product to be biologically contributive in open environment, like in field, because I mean, in the main, we're not seeing 60 or 70% of fish dying from ulcerative disease. We're not seeing, they're mostly moribund or reduced quality of life kinds of issues. I mean, ulcers can also cause a reduction in the value of the harvested fish and the flesh, because if in the main there are a lot of ulcers, then you go from a superior grade salmon to a standard grade, and then the value of that to the producer is lower. But so the chronic kind of disease circumstances that they see and that are observed in the field are a perfect environment for a probiotic approach, because we're not talking about improving it's not a sterile immunity or anything as one could hope you would achieve with a vaccine. It's more of a augmentation of the robustness of the fish, so that you see an improvement in the degree of 30%, for instance. And that's actually true in the controlled studies of lice and in the controlled studies against ulcerative disease. So that kind of measure where, overall maybe you're seeing 6, 7, 8% loss is very different than trying to study a probiotic and evaluate its efficacy in a challenge study where you're seeing 60, 70, 80%
Hmm.
loss in the population that's infected.
For sure. Yeah.
So,
And I think a lot of natural products like your probiotic products, that's kind of, we want to administer that before there's any kind of disease because you're setting that
Mhm,
fish up for success. But once
mm,
disease hits, yeah, then you need a different approach, right?
mm.
It's I think about like I'm a mom of kids and we try to keep them healthy. We give them healthy diets. We maybe give them supplements as well. But if they get strep throat, we're going to the doctor and they're going on
Yeah,
antibiotics, right? So,
absolutely.
yeah.
Um, I think, could comment on that. I mean, in general, the approach to managing bacterial disease outbreaks in Norway is that, the fish are routinely culled. There is very little antibiotic use because it's not permitted to have residues, for instance. So I know there's a higher allowance, but also, as I said before, in the face of baculum diseases, fish are usually inappetent. We all are inappetent when
Hmm.
we're very sick.
Hmm.
So having to deliver them a medical intervention with via the feed route is a very difficult
Right.
equation once the fish are actually sick.
That's
So
right. Yeah.
here it usually results in a early decision to actually cull or early harvest those fish actually.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. All right, I'm going to kind of move the conversation towards regulatory. So I think we have a really good understanding of your product and the efficacy and safety and how it was discovered. So you mentioned that it's a feed in Chile, and it sounds like it's also a feed in the European Union. But I know you've also got this classification, microbiological hygiene product, and that's not something that we have in Canada. So I wonder, could you just talk a little bit about that classification and how you got that?
Yeah, we consulted with our food safety authority here as to how a microbial product that is live and contributing to food animal production should be handled regulatorily. And they pointed us in the direction of the Department of Environment or the Environmental Agency of Norway. And so that is in the main, they regulate any microbial products into the greater environment. So they qualify the product on safety alone, leaving it to the fact that you've got a risk profile for a product that's so inconsequential, it's absolutely negligible. And then they say it's up to you, the producer and the breeder or the farmer, to contribute to whether this has a valuable impact both
Hmm.
on biology and on productivity and economy.
Yeah.
So that kind of says that yes, no problem, no objections to you having that product in the food chain and use on the food animal. No risk to the consumer, no risk to the environment. So you know, fill your boots and try to figure out together with the farmers if that's an effective product or not. So I mentioned we did the controlled trials on between 10 and 12 million fish. But in addition to that, now because we're running commercially and implementing on commercial populations, I think it's up to something like 60 million fish that have been implemented with the microbial product, Symbiont Vital. And we in 2022 we got permissions also. Iceland has a developing aquaculture industry, much more expansive at the moment than Norway. So we also got permission to be using the product in commercial terms in that environment.
Excellent.
So
Yeah.
on the horizon, with our submission to Chile, we expect to be approved in Chile in 2024, and likewise, as and when we have the wherewithal and the capacity, of course, we want to progress a European application as well.
That's
I mean,
fantastic, Kira. Yeah. And I love that approach that like Norway and Iceland have taken, where they've said, okay, we have no concerns about environmental safety, no concerns about human food safety, no concerns about target animal safety. And yeah, the onus is on you guys to ensure that it is providing a benefit. And I can tell
mm,
you, like the producers using that product, they're not going to buy it if they're not seeing a beneficial effect. So I've long
absolutely.
been an advocate of regulators focusing on the safety aspect and letting the market determine whether that product works. So
Mm,
I love that approach. I think it's very logical. So I'm really happy that you were able to get that in Norway because I think it makes a lot of sense.
it's
Um,
the same consideration as you know, given after Brexit, the EU departure from the EU from
mhm.
of the UK. I mean, Scotland is another big production
Yes.
area for salmon, and our approach and conversation with SEPA, the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency, have similarly followed the same lines. They will approve the product for dissemination into the food production system, in the marine environment, in the freshwater environment, on the basis of safety. And after that, it's up to us to qualify on the beneficial effects.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, and in a way, as you know, I mentioned that, people like this, or farms, it's concrete when you use a chemotherapeutic approach to control lice. Yes, my lice counts were this high last week, and now they're this low this week. It is evident immediately. A preventative approach is a little bit harder to convince them that they should invest in that solution. But we've come to pass now with cost benefit analysis that it is really a no-brainer decision to use this approach, that the actual economic impact is, well, I mean, I won't speak particularly of numbers, but I mean, it is so tremendously large, especially if you're treating and implementing on whole populations. If those fish are implemented, then the productivity gain is tremendous.
Yeah.
So
that's amazing, Kira. And I mean, another really important thing to consider too is if you're like producing chickens, for example, like the grow out period in Canada is about 42 days. It's quite short. But with salmon, that grow out is up to 3 years, I believe. And so I think your product, has a huge impact given how long it's going to take to get that fish to market size. So a question about, in terms of your current customers, what is their kind of response been with the product? Are they happy with it? Are they repurchasing?
yes, that's the frame we're in now. Of course, initially, all kind of productive inputs into aquaculture farming are usually qualified decisions that they will attempt at least to verify that they have inputted on 10% of their population, 20% of the population, maybe 2-3 cages on a site, and then they'll make a decision to go forward based on the analysis of the productivity in those cages versus the rest. Increasingly, I think, on top of commercial decisions, oftentimes that running like, an assessment kind of thing in a commercial circumstance is very tough. But we've turned this, if you could call it the reason to believe dial far enough that now they're implementing on 100% of the farm population, on 100% of farms in a zonal area. And that from the fact that if you could lever the term herd immunity into an application that should have benefit across the board, especially with regard to reduction in the infection levels of lice and lice travel great distances farm to farm, that this is going to be in the way that the maximal benefit of a preventive approach like this will be realized.
Amazing.
So that's the frame we're in now. Obviously, I mean, the economic decisions for some, it's a little bit understandable when you think about concrete terms and seeing your investment, but farmers like to invest in technology. I mean, in the main, so many farming companies now are investing in AI technology so that they have underwater cameras and they can observe their fish all the time, even throughout the winter months when you usually don't like to handle them. So those kinds of investment, new cage technology, easily made, even though they don't know the cost benefit or the value of that at the point of purchase. But there seems to be a much more hesitance to invest in biological solutions, especially not mandated ones, because vaccination is generally speaking a mandated thing related to their insurance qualification and stuff.
Okay.
So when it's a non-mandated sort of influence, then it takes quite a bit of time to be able to generate the data that you have good cost benefit analysis. But we're there now.
Good.
We have a perfect solution that we believe there will be much further market penetration. Many more populations will be treated in the next frame, which is our 2024 year.
Fantastic. So speaking about Canada regulatory, so you had previously attempted to bring your products to Canada via the veterinary health products route. So veterinary health products, VHPs for short. they're technically and by definition drugs, and I'm putting that in quotes, in dosage form that are specifically used to maintain, promote, optimize the health and welfare of animals. So this differs from drugs in the traditional sense in that they can't be used to treat, prevent, mitigate, relieve, or cure disease. So and we worked with you guys and we, looked at your product and the fact that it was completely natural and is really sort of working, prior to disease. That's when it has its best effects. And we felt that the VHP route was the most appropriate classification. As I mentioned before, the feeds route wasn't available because it's not administered via the feed. So we went forward and had a meeting with the VDD, and the VDD actually determined that your product would be a drug in Canada, which is incredibly unaligned with what you've seen in Chile and the European Union. So talk to me about why. Why did they make your product a drug?
Yeah, I guess first of all, I think that the advisors were concerned with the fact that it was taken transdermally. That's a drug term. But of course, as I spoke about before, the whole microbial ecology of fish is they interchange bacteria with their environment at all times. So it's not an unnatural route. It's not a drug application. It's a natural material. So we agreed at the time with your recommendations to approach that to use that natural product route. Their other concerns were that there wasn't much published on the Alivibrio genera and the nomenclature and the classification of these apathogenic Alivibrio species was not in the main in peer-reviewed literature. Mm-hmm. So we have advanced that and are publishing in the Systemic Journal of Nomenclature for Bacteria. That will be a peer-reviewed publication coming out shortly. So we've done the background work that's required, but I think, yeah, I don't think that the product, as we described, actually could meet. It's a mismatch to the regulations around drugs, especially because of the level of biological contribution without being one of those kind of kill kind of potency level products. So then, yeah, I mean, maybe you remember more about that consultation and then the early feedback from VDD. Mm-hmm. And I think maybe, of course, I mean, they're having a regulatory area governed under what is the Bureau of Veterinary Drugs means that they take a pharmacological approach to mm-hmm. most things. That's their expert area, that's their training. And it always was curious to me why there wasn't a consideration from either an environmental dissemination or a consultation. How would you view this, Environment Canada, or would you consider this as a biological product? Because that's obviously in the purview and control of the CFIA. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, we're not going to change the regulatory framework in Canada very, very soon. But what we'd really like the opportunity to do, as I said, we play around in the DFO project, realizing that, these ubiquitous health improving bacteria for the microbiome is true of all Atlantic salmon. I mean, not just Norwegian Atlantic salmon or Icelandic Atlantic salmon, but also Chilean Atlantic salmon. Well, they're an exotic species in Chile, but so be it. So we really are very keen on being able to, on the basis of safety, as we said to you, take the product out, show the productive influence, and all of those higher level objectives of increasing sustainability, opening up the options for more preventative approaches, seeing the actual struggles that farmers have today with the main areas of risk for them. These summer and winter wounds in Canada are also similarly here in Norway, and lice, of course, is a major challenge even because, and in the main, because of the treatments that have to be applied to control the lice levels below the trigger levels or treatment, means that those fish actually are basically handled and mishandled more than they should be in their productive life cycle.
Hmm.
So and I think that Canada also, um, absolutely, industry and regulators alike have a desire to reduce the use of chemicals, antibiotic mitigants, in control of disease. I mean, absolutely, prevention is better than cure.
Yes.
Prevention is better than treatment and firefighting. So we would love the opportunity and how we could vehicleize that solution, to provide, because we have a lot of interest. A lot of the farming companies are global. They have Norwegian companies have interest in Canada, Canadian companies have interest in Chile and the UK. So I mean, there's a lot of globalized, approaches, and they would all already welcome the productive tool that they're using in Norway, for instance,
Hmm.
in the Canadian operations. But therein lies the rub,
Hmm.
because if we consider a preventative treatment as something that could go where there's an unmet need, for instance, vaccines have been released under what would be considered emergency release
Hmm.
programming, even though they're preventative. Um, so there might be an avenue there, but that's quite restrictive in Canada these days, to use an emergency release,
Hmm.
sort of route to get a product to market, or get the product into a field of investigational stage at least.
Yeah, and
So,
it's so challenging, I think, in Canada. And here's the other thing is I feel like, the Norwegian authorities that you were speaking with were really enabling and really kind of coming up with approach that really made sense for your particular product.
mhm,
Whereas in Canada, when we had that meeting, they were really hung up on, like you said, the route of administration, and they considered it to be transdermal, which
mm,
really kind of made me think, okay, you guys don't really get fish. And
mm,
I think that's fair when you look at like the very few products approved for fish on the Vet Health Products Program.
mm,
And the other thing that really kind of irked me was this lack of history of use. And that's something, it's right on the main page of the Vet Health Products Program, that these products have a long history of use. There's lots of information in the published literature. The problem I have with that is I feel like it really stifles innovation. It does not allow for the discovery of new natural products
mm,
like yours.
mm.
And it doesn't mean that, like, I'm sure these strains have been around for thousands of years. We hadn't discovered them yet. And why should that block you from going the vet health products route?
Exactly.
I don't
Yeah.
get it, especially when you have the data that you have. So that was really
Mm.
frustrating to me because there was no way around that. We can't go back in time and create this history of use, right? We
There's
can't address
nothing
that.
particular about Canadians or about the Canadian environment, about the Canadian fish populations that makes them, that special. But regulators oftentimes want to see at least data generated on geographically
Hmm.
relevant data
Yeah.
generated. So obviously, I mean, the first approach to that would be yes. I mean, we will follow the specifics of
Hmm.
application and document safety in a geographic relevance to Canada. But at the same time, I mean, what we tried to contend is that they're so ubiquitous. I mean, and our expert collaborators on DFO would also say these species, this genera, these apathogenic strains that are considered beneficial to fish are ubiquitous in
Hmm.
every marine environment, in
Yeah.
every marine species, in every ocean, every fish. Do you know
Hmm.
what I mean?
Yeah.
So it was a little bit difficult, and you're right. Then if you haven't used something and it's grandfathered or historically used for multiple decades in Canada, then that it's not necessarily. It's almost like a realization of how critical it is to have good microbial content in the microbiome, and how that steers robust health, that the life of any species, including humans, is necessarily that we could maintain a good microbial community. I mean, the development of Crohn's and ileitis and some of those chronic diseases in, are also treated these days in humans with antibiotic treatment, but increasingly those have very poor efficacy results. So I mean, practitioners are using transplant of microbial communities from healthy donors and having 100% reversal on a pathogenic situation or a
Mm.
disease circumstance for those things. So it's not so novel that it should be scary. And of
Hmm.
course, I mean, the biological products that we work with are not are natural. They're not genetically manipulated. They're
Yeah.
not attenuated. There's nothing that's needed to be done with them aside from production wise growing them up en masse so that
Hmm.
we can actually provide the input at the right level to fish populations.
Yeah. And I
So,
think, and I said this on the previous podcast as well, but I think the big problem in Canada is the regulatory framework itself. So you've got these boxes, right? So the vet health products program, and I'm sure what the regulators are doing is they're going through each and they go, oh, okay, vet health product, no history of use, cross X, we can't
mm,
go there. And then you look
mm,
at the feeds route. Oh, it has to be administered via the feed. Can't go there. Then we go to
mm,
biologics route. And one of the requirements for a biologic is that it stimulates an immune response. Can't go there, must be a drug. And this is the issue
mm.
that I have is there's no ability to be agile or flexible. It's if you don't fit into one of these boxes, you are a drug. And I can say like with total confidence, your product makes no sense in the drug category. It just doesn't. It's not
Right.
a drug. It's a natural probiotic. It doesn't have a drug-like mode of action. I don't even see how we could be successful registering it as a drug because it just doesn't make any sense. I don't think you could meet those requirements. So,
No, I don't think so either. And, interestingly, the European Commission guidance on feed additives now says, in recognition of innovative approaches for productive introductions into food production systems, we recognize that alternative delivery routes, such as by water, should be included as a feed additive, let's call
interesting.
it.
Yep.
So that I mean, of course, as I expressed to you, we've yet to submit to the European Commission, but that was our scientific advice.
Yeah. And I think that, the regulators they obviously need to prioritize safety, absolutely. But I think they need to be more enabling to allow products like
Mm,
this to say, "Hey, wow, you know what? Your product can really help to fill an unmet need.
mm.
Let's work with you. Let's see how we can get this in." But I don't feel that from the Canadian regulators. It's
That's yeah, I think so. That was my impression at least, and it is a bit of an eroding situation in Canada, governmentally, politically, on support of aquaculture.
yes.
So, and I might be out of turn to speak about it, but certainly, our collaborators in DFO suggested that there's much less initiative and uh, um, list or desire to approve projects that will contribute to aquaculture versus they love projects that are about overseeing wild populations and fishery and etc.
Hmm.
So, but what I haven't broached on yet is the fact that we're trying to create a situation where you're respecting the natural biology of the fish, that has been in a way in the industrialized production of aquacultured species kind of yeah, I mean, you've seen the large kind of hatchery situations. I mean, these are industrial productions, and they, in order to be biosecure, in order to not have the introduction of disease containing water and organisms coming in, then biosecurity is in the main quite high. But that also reduces the natural quantity of apathogenic bacteria that are
Hmm.
necessary to sustain life. Just, I mean, some reflection on one clever uh, large fish producing company once designed a hatchery that would had 100% exclusion of bacterial content. It was a very high biosecure hatchery, and they did not. The fish that were within that facility did not grow. Like literally had such poor growth profile that it was obvious that it would mean that that's not a target to be 100% biosecure. In other words, I mean, and in recirculating aquaculture, it's quite an engineered situation. You have fish that are using, water that's recirculated. There are biofilters that manage the quality of the water, that reduce nitrates and ammonia and things that are naturally produced. That is a 100% successful situation where if you have a stable biofilter, then those water quality aspects are controlled by microbes. So it's quite normal and natural to expect that fish also need that microbial input, but that actually builds and makes them more robust rather than for instance, a managed water quality
Hmm.
situation.
Yeah.
And I do believe in Canada that introductions of microbes that are for biofilter or to to seed biofilters are actually, I don't think, regulated. You'll have to tell me if that's a qualified comment, but I believe that's true.
Yeah. I'm not 100% certain, but yeah. So Kira, I want to talk a little bit too about the fact that your product is being used in Norway and Iceland and Faroe Islands.
Mhm.
Sounds like it will soon be used in Chile and Scotland. So, just for our listeners, the aquaculture industry for salmonids is quite concentrated in four main countries: Canada, Chile, Norway, and Scotland, and Faroe Islands as well, to a lesser extent.
Mm.
So it sounds like very soon, like probably within the next year, all of these jurisdictions are going to have access to your product, except for Canada. In 2021, Canada imported $75 million worth of farmed salmon from Norway. Your product is used by salmon producers in Norway, which means not only that those producers have an advantage over Canadian producers because they can access your product, but it also means that Canadians are very likely consuming salmon that have been administered your product. And this
Mhm.
is a really kind of like contentious issue with me when we're talking about, safety and the fact that our producers don't have access to this. I'm just really frustrated, especially with these natural products that are completely safe, that have these benefits, and your data is quite good. I've seen it. It clearly has a beneficial effect on the fish, and our producers can't get it because of this regulatory burden. So I'm wondering if you have had conversations with Canadian producers, or are they frustrated? Do they want your product?
Oh, absolutely. I don't think they have enough tools at their disposal to manage their production, and they want to be able to avail themselves to consider at least any opportunity to avoid firefighting and use preventative measures to as a part of their sustainability program. I mean, people don't salmon industry in most respects and most professional companies, they don't just green speak about that. They really would like to
Hmm.
improve on sustainability, environmental impact and socio-ethical responsibility. I
Of
mean,
course.
they really are should be lauded and at least supported in that endeavor, obviously.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, that's a curious thing. I mean, but as you know, there are no trade barriers for the use of biologicals country to country. It's actually part of international law that if you have, and it makes sense, right? So there shouldn't be, if you have a disease in a certain region, biological measure to address that in terms of vaccination, and you don't have that disease in Spain, for instance,
Hmm.
then Spanish importers can still import fresh fish from any environment. It doesn't. That's not a trade barrier.
Hmm.
So yeah, it is an interesting thing, and it's the safety to consumers, of course, that would be really officially in the remit of Health Canada.
Yeah.
So again, I mean, we can provide all the data needed for that.
Yeah.
But
Absolutely.
I like your approach. We hope we can get some interest in opening up the space so that innovative solutions can be realized, especially if there are absolutely no risk related to
Yes.
the introduction of it's not their responsibility to qualify the product on effect so that the producers will use it or that we can sell
Hmm.
it, just on the fact that it's safe for the environment, the consumer, and to the target animals and themselves.
Yeah. I totally
So
agree.
yeah,
Yeah. So, Kira, my final question for you, and I feel like this is probably obvious, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What do you need to see happen on the regulatory side to reignite your pursuit of the Canadian market?
Well, the Canadian regulations, in my experience with the Canadian Food Inspection Agency and the Bureau of Biologicals, has been that they're very keen on harmonized regulation. I mean, and in other aspects, I mean, Canadian researchers, Canadian governmental employees, they're pursuing, they're involved in international projects like this. Like ones that are using microbial intervention approaches for food production systems, evaluating that. There's a group called Aurora also that have involvement of many Canadian researchers that is about microbes in oceanic environments, and they have a very clear view that they need to formally give advice at least and a policy paper on the fact that this doesn't have a proper space, it doesn't fit, as you said, in the box, then it's excluded. But does it present a risk? No. So that sort of decision making, I think, might follow along the political lines of a distaste for aquaculture in Canada. But I mean, on coastal communities, on regions like the Eastern Seaboard, Bay of Fundy, British Columbia, there is a lot there are a lot of people in those communities employed in aquaculture. I mean, so do you want it? Do you want to be a player, or do you want to have food production? Because obviously, we didn't speak about this, and it's probably too long in the tooth to get into. But as a protein source, the sustainability of aquaculture is much higher than the sustainability of farmed land animals, the utilization and space and time. So I think that it deserves, when initiatives want to be taken that improve that sustainability, that at least those industries should be supported. And now, if you're not going to support aquaculture in Canada, then then don't just kind of constrain the industry until the point where they can't be successful anymore by atrophy. If you have policy decisions that mean that you're not going to support that, then okay, but I mean, that doesn't ring very, very Canadian, in other words. So I've seen I started out that conversation by saying I've seen other regulatory groups in Canada understand a new technology is coming, understand that they should be prepared, hiring particularly qualified scientists who would then be the assessors on that category of product, to be able to be prepared to regulate that product. So what I see is, like, it's kind of a misfit related to microbial ecological approach for it to be regulated in the VBD. And maybe it's a misfit that this natural products category is actually in that, as you said, with quotation marks, a drug regulatory body.
Yeah. So that's great, Kira. I'm really glad you touched on that issue, because I do think aquaculture does have sort of a bad rep, and it shouldn't. It's not fair. It's not justified. It's not science-based. So I'm really glad that you went there. I was hoping you would. So that brings us to the end of my questions here. Thank you so much for discussing this with me. I really do hope that we'll see your probiotic aquaculture products on the market in Canada, because it's so needed. And I know the Canadian producers desperately need products like this to keep their fish healthy and to help us feed the world. That's what producers do. To our listeners, if you want to learn more about Previwo and the amazing work this company is doing, you can visit their website at previwo.com. Also, to our listeners, thank you for tuning in. All of our podcasts will be posted on our website at pauldickassociates.com, as well as our Paul Dick & Associates YouTube channel. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter for important updates pertaining to the animal health industry. And finally, if you have experienced regulatory challenges in Canada or other jurisdictions, we would love to hear from you, and we would love to help. You can find our contact info on our website. Thank you.